Hello, everybody. I'm Deborah Lockwood from Life Changer, and I am here with another in our episodes for Success in Cardiology. I'm delighted to welcome today Professor Rachel Myles, who is Professor of Cardiac Electrophysiology at the University of Glasgow, and she has been a clinician scientist throughout her career. And the first question, so first of all, welcome. And the first question I would like to ask is, why do you think that so few women are involved in particularly the higher levels of academic cardiology?
Just to start by saying thanks so much for having me, and to talk about a really interesting topic and something that I think about more and more as my clinical academic career progresses. It's a really great question that you ask and a really difficult one, and I think it's got I don't know the full answer, and I think the answer is probably multifaceted. Um, I think there are probably aspects of a clinical academic career which are not hugely aspirational, perhaps to anybody, but maybe particularly to women. And I'm thinking around some of the practical issues about the length of time it takes, the perception of how much work there is, long hours, and that sort of thing. Um, but actually, honestly, I think women are less put off by some of that than we might imagine. Loads of women do loads of really challenging and difficult things with long hours and everything else. And I do wonder and worry about whether there is something more about the culture within academia that is not aspirational. So sometimes it can be there can be aspects of it being very competitive and it being about a single person developing their own portfolio and almost kind of becoming famous for what they've done. And I do wonder sometimes whether women are more motivated, and these are really broad generalizations, just excuse me for that, but whether women might tend to be more motivated towards teamwork, towards coming together in teams, towards shared goals, and to making a difference that way. And I guess there definitely is a move, I think, in science and academia towards that kind of really collaborative team science approach, away from a kind of pyramid type of model, which is the more kind of traditional model. And I guess one of my hopes is that will mean that academia will be a more aspirational career for the hugely talented workforce of women that we have in cardiology who could contribute so much.
Mm-hmm. Because I certainly have noticed that a lot of the women that I see in cardiology, and particularly perhaps in the more junior ranks of cardiology, have done or are doing PhDs. So there's some interest in academia, or they wouldn't go down that path, one would assume, but there are other possible reasons of doing a PhD. What do you think people's motivations are for doing a PhD if they then don't go into academia?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think there are different reasons. So where I work in Glasgow, and I trained here, the norm would be that anyone getting a specialty training number in cardiology would have done a higher degree of some form, an MD or a PhD. Um, and so there is really that expectation that to secure a place in clinical training that you need to have done that. And so there are some people who will go into it knowing that it's not really what they want, but it's a means to an end. And I have to say, some of those people I think will change their minds a little bit, because cardiology is such an evidence-based specialty that even if you think you're a really dyed-in-the-wool clinician and you've got no interest in doing research, it is compelling when you start doing it and you see the value of it in everyday practice. So I think even some of those people will start to change their minds, but the question is, do they change their mind enough that they're then going to try to try to get over the hurdles that are put in front of them for an academic career, which for sure is challenging. And then there are the other people who I think are excited about research but finish their PhD and find that road either off-putting or too difficult or not set up in a way that works for their timescales. So one of the things we've seen locally is really talented, fantastic women doing really great PhDs and people saying, we want you to stay in research, but they say, one thing at a time. I'm actually having a family over here and trying to get my head around how I'm going to get to CCT and become a consultant and deal with all of that. And then those people might want to re-enter academic work post CCT when things are a bit more settled. And I think we could do a lot more within the academic pathway to try and facilitate different ways to do it. There shouldn't just be one way to become a clinical academic. And
So what do you think, what is the way to become a clinical academic, and what other ways should we be developing?
yeah, so I guess the standard path right now is that you do a PhD, then you would apply for a clinical lectureship that would allow you to do um, develop some of your own post-PhD research while you're doing your clinical training. Um, and so this is what I did, and then so you can then build into that. For example, I went to the States for a year, did a postdoc entirely nothing clinical in that year, just research. And I also had an intermediate fellowship. So again, that in an ideal progression through a clinical training pathway for academia, you would have a personal fellowship at some point, which is a really high bar, difficult thing to get, lots and lots of time and planning and loads of support needed to do that. So I think it inevitably, and I guess just to finish off, then you would expect around the time of CCT that you would be in a position for a substantive academic appointment at a university. So I haven't been employed by the NHS for a very long time. I've been employed through the university, and that would be the kind of standard route. But what that requires is that your clinical training and your academic training kind of happen at the same time. So your clinical training is necessarily lengthened by that process.
Do you
And
have an
again,
idea of
sorry, on you go.
Yeah, do you have an idea of the average amount of time it takes after, for example, deciding, okay, I finished with my house officer residency type jobs and I'm going to train in cardiology? How long then does the training become if you want to go this academic route that you've said? Because usually, a PhD is going to add 3 years anyway. And then more as a clinical lecturer will extend it further. So
Yeah.
so how many extra years do you think are involved in becoming a?
Yeah, so this is not based on data, but I would guess for most people it's 2 or 3. So lectureships can vary between 20% research and 50% research. Um, and really, most people would need 50% for at least some of their training to be able to make it, to be able to start developing their own independent research program and really do something meaningful that would take them through those fellowship applications. So I think, and again, it depends a little bit whether you're doing an interventional subspecialty or not. So I was doing interventional EP when I was training, and so so I think probably I definitely had 3 years, I think, in my cardiology training more than my peers, and then also the PhD on top of that. But everybody here would have done a PhD anyway. So
Mm.
um, it's on average, I would say 2 or 3 years extra.
Okay.
I find it easy now as a consultant to view that as a positive thing, right? Because the longer you can spend training, the more you learn. For me, it was fantastic, but not everybody views it that way, and people have their lives to try and plan and navigate while they're doing all of this as well.
Hmm. So, I mean, doing this as a trainee all the way through those extra years means also that you would not be paid as much as you would if you were, for example, if you finished your CCST and managed to get into academia later. Would that be fair to say?
So I guess it depends. So you would the fellowships in the university would I think always they would always honor your registrar salary, but you wouldn't move on to a consultant salary as soon. So yeah.
Mhm. And I heard at the recent British Cardiac Society meeting that the British Heart Foundation in particular was hoping to open up some kind of funded ways to fund people who are beyond CCST to help them to get extra work time, academic time. Because I think one of the issues for women going into it is the finances and the time and the extension of time with low finances if they also have a family. So to support, I mean, if they've
Yes.
got someone else bringing in the money, then fair enough. But a lot of them don't. And so, whereas the other aspect of it, particularly if they want to do an interventional type job, is that having a family while doing, for example, a PhD is often quite a good time to be pregnant because you're not in and out of the lab and so on. But it is also, a time where you don't have much money. So, how would you say, how did that work out for you? And in retrospect, how would you prefer maybe to have done it?
Yeah, I am. So I when did Ben come along? I'm trying to think. So I was so I had him around about the time that I CCT'd, I think, and I definitely was pregnant and in the lab at times because I remember the stress and unpleasantness of that. So my children were quite late in comparison to my PhD. So my PhD was at the
Mm.
start really of my registrar training or before it. And then I didn't have kids until the end. Um, so I was definitely at some point uh, pregnant or with a small child at home that I was worried about. Also in the EP lab, thinking who's going to pick up the baby from nursery if I cause a tamponade here and can't leave, type of thing. So it definitely wasn't ideal. Um, but I think in terms of how I would have changed it, I mean, you you can't really, like, life has to happen, and having your family has to be the big priority, I think. And it's what I guess we need to try and get, and things like the BHF's initiative will hopefully help, is just to build in more flexibility into the whole thing so that people can be supported as much as possible to have that academic door be open at the time that's right for them, and for just the whole thing not to look like a completely monstrous task that can't be overcome. Because I guess the other thing is that as women we do tend to maybe underestimate our capacity a bit, or be more likely to think, that's something that can only be done by super smart, capable people, and I'm just normal. And actually that's not the case. There are loads of super smart, capable people who maybe think that. And I think, again, these are sweeping generalizations for which I apologize, but I think in general terms, my male colleagues, at least the ones that are in academia, are far more likely to think, of course I can do that. Yeah, that's, yeah, I can do that. Whereas women don't as often, I think, have that really strong self-belief, which sometimes borders on delusional, but can be helpful at propelling people through those difficult points. The kind of imposter syndrome type of idea, I think, is much more frequent in women. And I think that links in to one of the reasons why women are more likely to put off. It looks really hard, and you're more predisposed to believe that maybe you're not as capable as is needed when actually probably you do a great job.
Well, and of course, there's the fact that there's been somewhat of a lack of role models because there aren't a lot of women in academia, and hence this interview showing a
Yes.
successful academic cardiologist who has children and is doing fine. So
Yeah.
yeah, I agree entirely, and I think there are a lot of women who really are capable. I think that having children is something though that most women want to have them at some stage. Evolutionarily, we have wanted to wait until we have a safe environment to bring a child into, with a supportive partner and so on, and that does lead, I think, to people putting it off, as you did and as I did, until after we get our stable consultant post. And that really is a little bit later than it should be. It should be possible to have children earlier when you're younger, and it's safer to be pregnant for a start. I mean, I think there's also some data that there are more complications in pregnancy for women cardiologists, and a lot of that is probably accounted for by the fact that we tend to have our children so late. So
Yeah. Yeah.
would like to encourage people to have children earlier, and really during PhD years seems like quite a good time to have them. And but financially, how is it for you when you're doing a PhD and when you're doing a clinical lecture? You said the registrar salary is kind of taken into it. How is that for managing children and childcare and so on?
Yeah, so for I mean, it's now a long time ago that I did my PhD, obviously, but so for me at that time, clinical salaries were very inflated by on-call supplements. So in doing my PhD, I lost all of that on-call supplement. So actually my salary went down pretty hugely, and doing PhD was financially more challenging. I didn't have kids at that time, so I didn't have that pressure. And we did have the facility locally for people doing PhDs to pick up some locum work. So that would be the usual thing that we would supplement, which again is fine if you don't have a family also to look after, but to think about raising a family and doing a PhD and picking up locum work in order to supplement a salary, I think would be pretty difficult. Um, I I think that the same thing would apply. Um, I think once you're in post PhD in a registrar training program, it depends a little bit on the local arrangement. So I was always able to keep my slot on the on-call rota, even though I wasn't
Mhm.
doing the day-to-day cardiology at 100%. So that meant that my salary was then protected during my registrar training. But that again, that might be slightly subject to different local conditions.
Mhm. Okay, so people should look into finding out what they can do.
Yeah,
Can they
and
do locums, and can they do
exactly.
on calls? And
And the other thing that can be hidden, although I think it's changing now that most funders are covering university tuition fees, but we had to pay university tuition fees for our PhDs because at that time the funders didn't cover it. But I think that's very unusual now. For most funders will cover the PhD fees because you don't want to have a bill of several £1,000s of fees when you're just found a salary drop as well. It's not ideal.
Hmm. So how can we encourage more people to go into academia?
Okay, so that you've already mentioned role models, and I think role models are really important. And it doesn't just apply to women, but to all underrepresented groups. People are just less likely to consider a path if they don't see anyone that looks like them who's trod that path before. And so I think having role models is really, really important, making those role models visible and providing for some mentoring, accepting that the people who maybe hesitate to put themselves forward could be brilliant contributors as academics, but they might need a little bit more input in terms of mentoring in order to see that opportunity and that value and that it could work for them. So so I think that that is one aspect of it. And there's that needs to happen at loads of different levels. It needs to happen in individual regions, in individual universities. It needs to happen at cardiology meetings. There needs to be visibility of female academics in all of those places. When people read papers, as far as you can tell what someone's sex is from their name, they need to be able to see that there are women represented in the groups doing the research. Um, and then I think the funders and the universities have a role in terms of trying to change the flexibility that's in the system. Um, we all have a role as cardiologists and clinical academics to, I think, talk to people early about what their career choices are and try and what their career opportunities are and try and match them up. With mentors, and that doesn't have to be people like I get emails from people all over the place saying, would you talk to so and so about an academic career and what you needed to do? And I'm always happy to do that because if one or two of those people gets some encouragement out of that and some useful information, then they may go down a path that they otherwise didn't think was for them. So I think there's a whole series of that sort of work that needs to be done to try and open it up a little bit. And I do think as well that we need to try and understand the barriers better. So it's something that I would really like to try to do. So the BHF and the British Cardiac Society did this census exercise together where they looked at one of the things they looked at was sex balance across different subspecialties. And of course, academic cardiology had a really low reporting number anyway, but also it was incredibly uh, poor in terms of female representation, as was electrophysiology and most of the interventional subspecialties. So I do think there's a need for data about really what are the barriers. I think it's too easy to think that it's all about when you're going to have your babies and how long it takes. I've maybe said this before, but I am one of the things that is really strikingly different for my job than my clinical colleagues is the degree of flexibility that I have. And they might look at it and think that's dreadful because that flexibility means you're reviewing grants at 11 o'clock at night. And there are days when I would agree with them. But also, I pick my kids up from school 2 or 3 days a week because I prioritize that as something that is really important for me to do as a mum. Their dad is very often away, and so I think it's important for them. But I have the flexibility to make that choice. If I had a full-time NHS job, then I wouldn't have the flexibility to make that choice without dropping some PAs and changing things around, etc. So I think maybe there's a place for a bit more talking about what the upside is for women in academia. Actually, I think a lot of academic teams, particularly as I go up through the seniority, you find yourself in a lot of rooms where there are a lot of men, and actually you can add loads of value just by having a slightly different approach to communication sometimes in those rooms, and that can be really rewarding to be able to go in and make those differences. So so maybe there is a case for just bringing out some of the real positives of an academic career. And I think as I started by saying, kind of drifted on, but it started by saying trying to really understand what some of the barriers are. I think that there are some things that are not aspirational about a research career, particularly for women, and I would like to try to understand those better, because then I think we would be able to address the problem a little bit more conclusively, because I don't think it's time is a huge barrier, but I think there are other things too.
So one of the things that comes to mind for me is that, if you didn't go into academia kind of early on following your standard route and you went up and became a consultant cardiologist, or an American attending, getting into research at that stage really requires you to demonstrate some experience and involvement, because you're a more senior person, so you ought to have, a number of papers, or, been the primary investigator in a trial and so on. So one of the things that I think is then difficult at that point, because it's not really that difficult to get into research, but what is difficult is getting remunerated for the time that you spend doing that. So it's hard to get protected research time, and it's hard sometimes to show that you were doing something productive, so that people will pay you for all the time that you spent doing it. And like that, that can be a barrier, I think, for getting in later. And I wonder though, why is it that, again, women find that more of a barrier, I think, than men? Is it just that they, have more time because they're not looking after their family, or, so that they can donate it, if you like, for free? Or is it just that women perceive that as more of a barrier than it maybe really is? Or that they aren't as good at negotiating to be remunerated for the work that they've done?
I think it could be any or all of those things, and there's kind of uh, it's the so there are a couple of schemes in the UK where you can get, the British Heart Foundation has one, and the Chief Scientist Office in Scotland has one, where you can get parts of your time paid as an NHS consultant to do research. Um, but my own view is that, and that's great, and I think that should be developed, and that should be a route for people who want to spend not the majority of their time, but want to have remunerated time in academia. That's great, and it can also be a mechanism to start re-entry back into a university position for the people that really want that. But I think, as you've maybe suggested, that some exposure to research should be the norm for most consultant cardiologists. Is such an important part of everything that we do, that I feel like that should almost be built in to most job plans, some degree of research. And that can be very simple things that can just be around, collecting routine data and using that to inform clinical practice. But sometimes those things are hugely powerful, actually. Um, So I agree with you. I think it would be ideal if we could have almost less of a separation between clinical cardiologists and academic cardiologists. There should be a spectrum in between from, my sister-in-law who's a EP consultant and doesn't want to do any research and me who does loads, that, there should be a bell curve in between the two of us and in an ideal world then people would be able to tailor the amount of research that they wanted to do, and of course it all has to be justified by the impact and everything else, but that would be ideal. I think that research is recognized as an integral part of cardiology because I think it is an integral part of our practice.
Mm-hmm. And I think we should make a plug also that you were saying that women have this kind of imposter syndrome and am I good enough and will they want me? As it said, if you don't ask, then there's 100% chance you won't get. And if you do ask, then at least there's a chance that you will. And you need to, most of the people that I've talked to who have made it have said that one of the things that sets them apart from particularly other women is that they were prepared to ask and ask and ask and ask until somebody, let them join a project or let them lead a project or allowed them to have time off from clinical work to do a project or, and it often does require repeated asking, not just one off and then give up.
Yeah. And I mean, I absolutely think that's right. And, I can see the points in my career where I did that. Um, but I also remember the discomfort associated with doing that and the kind of, I'm asking for special treatment and am I being, am I being too difficult here? And I think those are traits overrepresented in females relative to males probably. And I think, we can probably do a lot. So I needed support to kind of stand and ask for those things. People said this is okay, you should do this, this is not unreasonable. And I think there's a cultural difference in how we take being told no or being told
Mhm.
that's not good enough or a rejection. I see some of my male colleagues here and it's water off a duck's back and it can knock me, you know, the same response can knock me in a different way. And that's partly intrinsic to my personality and wiring. But again, I
Very
think it's
common.
it's
Very
it's
common.
overrepresented, isn't it, in women. So then that becomes stuff we need to talk to our girls about. That starts being stuff that we need to engage schools about
Mhm.
making sure that women feel equally valued, seen, heard, across the whole of society, I guess. That feeling that I would rather not ask a question than ask it and be told no,
Mhm.
that's not unique to me, and that's not something that has developed as I've been a cardiologist. That's something that's been with me from a very young age. So, you know, I think recognizing that's important. It's much easier to ignore it once you say what it is and stand outside yourself and recognize it. But but yeah, it's really interesting where that comes from culturally and whether or not the way that we are now schooling and educating our children, whether in 15 years' time, my daughter will feel the same as I do about those things. Based on her behavior now, I don't think she minds being told no, but we'll see what she's like when she's an adult.
Oh, lovely. Okay, so let me just ask you one final question. If you were talking to early career cardiology trainee, say, who is interested in following a career in academia, what would be really your best piece of advice for them?
So I think the the most important thing for me really has been the supportive team around me that have allowed me to kind of follow what I wanted to do. And I think trying to do this in isolation or in circumstances where you don't have shoulders to stand on and cheerleaders for you, I think is really difficult. So I think I would say spend some time working out who that team is, constructing that team, going and finding people. People like me love talking to people who are interested in academia, right? We love to feel like our opinion is important and that our experience might help some other people. So I would say really build that team around you and use that support. Try not to do it in isolation, and just believe that you can succeed. If you have a passion for research in a particular area, then that's the building blocks of everything that you need, and all the other stuff can be collected and learned and worked out.
Wonderful. Well,
So that was probably three things rather than one, sorry.
absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights, and wish you the very best with the rest of your career. And I think some of the things you said may lead to people approaching you. So I hope you're prepared to answer their questions. And
Absolutely. I'll be glad if there are people out there who are interested. And it's been really lovely talking to you. Thanks.
thank you.